Death, taxes, and the Seahawks having a terrible offensive line. There are very few things that we can absolutely guarantee these days, but all three of those are usually among them. Or maybe at least one of them used to be. I'll admit that when I first started watching tape on the Seattle offensive line this week, I fully expected this to be an episode about terrible pass blocking technique and questionable at best personnel management. But by the end of my study sessions, believe it or not, I came away with the exact opposite impression. Yes, the Seahawks have still given up 12 sacks so far this year, but, and bear with me here, the tape isn't as bad as the numbers. And to illustrate that, I will of course go through all 12 of those sacks with you just to show you what I'm talking about, but from a purely top-down perspective on all those pressures, hits, and sacks, I think they could be divided into several distinct categories, some of them obviously more concerning than others. Among those categories, you have your standard sack where an individual blocker just gets beat one-on-one, and that's probably the kind of sack you always imagine when you think of the Seattle offensive line, but here's the thing. There were just 3 of those kinds of sacks across 2 games, which is only a quarter of all the sacks taken. There were also 3 sacks that I qualify as pressure design sacks, meaning it's not so much the offensive line getting smoked individually, as it is just the defensive coordinator coming up with some really creative blitzes or really well executed stunts that free people up just on scheme alone. A lot of others would throw those in with your standard offensive lineman getting beat kind of sack, but anyone who's played offensive line knows that sometimes stunts are just called at the exact right time and they're executed so well that there's really not much you can do about it, so I'm not going to knock the line itself too badly for those. And after that, you have the sacks that were the fault of Russell Wilson himself, of which there were also 3. Those can be anything from him not recognizing and adjusting to an obvious blitz look pre-snap and having a free rusher in his face with no outlet to throw to, or just him holding the ball way too long and being indecisive, which puts his blockers in an unnecessarily tough position. In addition to all of those categories, you also have 1 sack each in categories like miscommunication sacks, which was a rookie tight end making a mental error in the passing off of a rusher on literally the first offensive snap of his career, so that's a pretty understandable and normal mistake that I can't really fault the offensive line for. You've also got 1 coverage sack, which speaks for itself because it wasn't really anyone's fault individually, so much as it was just really good coverage from Chicago that forced Russell to hold the ball while the pocket collapsed in front of him. And then to round it all off, you have what I call a protection design sack, which to me is more of a fault in coaching and play design than anything else because someone had the idea to chip Khalil Mack from the inside rather than the outside, and all that did was just force Mack even wider to get even more of a running start than usual that he then used to absolutely obliterate Germain Ifedi on a power move. In my opinion, if you're going to chip a Hall of Fame caliber edge rusher to help out your right tackle, I don't care how wide he lines up, you put your tight end on his outside shoulder as an automatic adjustment in your alignment, and you chip his ass hard from the outside every single time. If you do it from the inside, you're really not going to get a good piece of him anyway, and all that does is just put your right tackle in an even worse position than he was before. So yes, you technically could fault Ifedi on this one, but realistically speaking, from a coaching perspective, you don't expect anyone short of Lane Johnson to be able to handle Mack one-on-one anyway. To me, that's on the coaches and the coordinator for not helping their guy out. If you know your tackle cannot handle a one-on-one with an elite player, don't give him that one-on-one. That's just my 2 cents, but anyway, I digress. What I want to do here is give a few examples of the 3 categories of pressure that the Seahawks are struggling the most with so far, which is handling individual blocks, handling well-designed pressure packages, and of course Russell Wilson making mistakes himself. And I want to show how, in my opinion, this Seattle offensive line is really not as far away from functional as people think. So first up, let's talk about the main problem that people are noticing, which is blockers just flat out losing their one-on-one battles. Look at this sack from Von Miller when he was matched up with Ifedi as an example, and this was a perfect illustration of why this was a terrible, terrible matchup for Ifedi and why he never should have been left alone with a player of this caliber in the first place. Look at Miller's hands here, and I'll show you this from 2 different angles so you can really get the full view. Vaughn has his left hand shooting up and into Ifedi's right shoulder pad to give him something to grab onto, while at the same time from the other angle you get a good view of his right hand controlling the left wrist of Ifedi. So Vaughn has 2 points of contact here, and he's going to try to control the balance and leverage of Ifedi while also controlling Ifedi's hand so that he can't get a hold of Vaughn's pads himself and recover. And simultaneously, while Miller is using those points of contact to grab and throw Ifedi forward and off balance, he's linking his hands to his feet and sidestepping to the outside while still keeping his hips pointed inside at the quarterback. So there's a lot going on here with hands and feet and hips, and it's all happening at exactly the same time in a fraction of a second. And unfortunately for Seattle, Ifedi is just not talented or refined enough to deal with a lightning quick, ultra fluid move like this. He stumbles forward totally off balance, and Vaughn gets by him pretty easily and flattens down around the edge for the sack. He's done this more times than I can possibly count throughout his career at this point. But I suppose the fact that Vaughn does do this so regularly also ties into my overall thoughts on this category of sack and why I accordingly don't really hate this play that much. Almost nobody is talented or refined enough to deal with a move like this. This is not just a statement about Ifedi, it's a statement about most tackles. I can count the number of right tackles on one hand that I think I could sort of maybe trust against someone like Von Miller one-on-one, and there's only one tackle that I don't think would need much help at all, of course referring to Lane Johnson. Obviously, Germain Ifedi is not one of those elite right tackles, and asking him to block Miller and having him fail to do so should not be an indictment of the Seattle offensive line as a whole. He's not going to go against a guy like Miller every week, so don't expect this line to give up sacks like this every week. If anything, and I touched on this before, this sack is the fault of the protection call for putting Ifedi in this position in the first place. You're not going to put your second best corner against Julio Jones all game with no safety help, so why would you put your second best tackle against Von Miller or Khalil Mack all game with no help themselves? That just makes no sense to me. So while yes, the Seattle offensive line has struggled at times to handle one-on-ones against elite pass rushers, so does basically every other team, and the adjustment to be made here is not a large one. Just give him help, that's it. It's not that big of a red flag to get beat by an elite player, because everybody gets beat by elite players. That's why they're elite. Now, moving on to Seattle's next biggest problem up front, and this has been a common theme around the league with a lot of different offensive lines so far this year, handling stunts. This is another sack from Denver at the end of the first half in an obvious passing situation with the Seahawks trying to get some points before halftime, and in my opinion this was really more of a credit to the Broncos D-line than a knock on Seattle's O-line. It's a really creative and well-designed stunt, and they were able to get home here without Von Miller even being on the field, so that says a lot to me. Watch Brandon Marshall here for starters. You can see him creeping up on this weak side A-gap as if he's blitzing, and next to him you've got Shane Ray standing up and covering the weak side B-gap. Since Bradley Chubb is also there in a 4-point stance looking to rush off the edge, naturally the Seahawks slide protection that way, expecting some sort of 3-on-3 rush. Seattle also has CJ Prosise ready to chip on the edge as well, so really it's more of a 3-on-3.5 when you think about it. Now, let's go through how this rush is designed to free people up against a full slide in protection. Off the snap, you see Chubb and Ray slanting inside, and it kind of looks like Marshall is starting to wrap around the outside on a twist. However, Marshall isn't actually blitzing, and in reality he was just disguising his coverage duties of Prosise as a blitz. This is called the peel technique because you show pressure to try to occupy and confuse the offensive line, and then peel off in coverage and take away the immediate outlet receiver from the quarterback. Now, let's roll it back a little bit here. Since Marshall is peeling off in coverage, it's no longer 3 rushers against 3 blockers. It's 2 rushers against 3 blockers. Numbers disadvantage aside though, they're still able to get home here because of some really clever execution on the part of Ray and Chubb. Ray's main job is to occupy the eyes and attention of the left guard, Ethan Pocic, just long enough for Chubb to come slamming into him from the side with as little warning as possible. Pocic recognized it pretty quickly, but he still had virtually no time to square himself up with Chubb and get low enough to absorb this bull rush. And because Pocic couldn't properly anchor in time, that bull rush was able to generate a lot of lateral movement towards the inside of the pocket. Now, after Chubb crosses underneath Ray, it's Ray's turn to become the wrapper around the outside. That's what left tackle Dwayne Brown has been waiting for this whole time. As soon as Chubb darted inside, Brown knew that a wrap around the outside would soon follow, whether it was Marshall, Ray, or both. However, because Chubb generated so much movement against Pocic on that bull rush, Brown was unable to fully pass Chubb off to Pocic, and if he did pass Chubb off completely and take on Ray, that would effectively leave Pocic totally out to dry at a really bad angle to wall off Chubb's inside rush. And that's the whole point with this stunt in the first place. That's the point of all stunts and twists actually when you think about it. You want to push the guard one way with a slant inside and pull the tackle the other way with a wrap outside. When you get both of those protectors moving in opposite directions and isolated in those one-on-ones, it creates absolutely horrible angles for the protection to deal with and naturally opens up a huge seam for Chubb to work through. So, with Chubb working through that natural seam inside and Ray working around that edge as the wrapper, and keep in mind it's not like the center Justin Britt is at any better of an angle to deal with this than anyone else is, there's really nowhere for Wilson to go. He has to run for his life from the start and eventually gets cleaned up by Shaq Barrett coming from the other edge, and while we want to mock and scold the line for letting this happen, there's really not that much they can do to stop a perfectly executed rush game like this. It's almost like a Russell Wilson deep ball for a 40-yard touchdown against really good coverage. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you do, it's just gonna happen. Ray did a phenomenal job occupying Posic's eyes, which led to him being a hair late to anchor against Chubb, which led to the interior seam opening up, which also led to the wrapper coming free, and then Barrett got to clean up the entire mess in the end. That's not bad offensive line play. That's just really good defensive line play. And to be honest, you should expect this kind of stuff out of a Bill Kollar coached defensive line in Denver by now, because he's essentially been the defensive line equivalent to Dante Scarnecchia for going on 30 years. That's how damn good a coach he is and always has been, and it shows in sacks just like this one. They're just gonna happen. That's just how it is when you play against this front. However, and this is a very big however, not all of those sacks were caused by either good line play from the defense or bad line play from the offense. Wilson was responsible for just as large a share of his own sacks as any member of his offensive line, and he should be held accountable for that as well. In fact, 3 of the sacks he took against Chicago, which was half of the Bears' total sacks, were in my opinion predominantly the fault of Wilson himself. Let's look at the sack he took on Seattle's opening drive, which ended the drive inside of Bears territory and almost certainly took away a scoring opportunity early on. I've talked a lot about capping safeties before, and I've also talked a lot about how good Wilson is in empty formations before, so if you've seen a lot of past episodes on this channel, you could probably already tell exactly where I'm going here, but just in case you're new, a capping safety is when a safety is lined up somewhere between 10 to 12 yards off of a slot receiver, or a tight end, or a flexed out running back, what have you, that also has another defender on them seemingly in man coverage. The safety is the cap on top of the other underneath defender. And when a safety is capping over the top of that slot receiver, like Eddie Jackson is here, that's a huge red flag for a blitz from the slot, because most of the time the only instance where a safety is lining up directly over a receiver at only a 10 to 12 yard depth is if he's going to take him in man coverage while the slot defender blitzes. If he was in a deep zone responsibility, he probably would not be that shallow, and he definitely wouldn't be lined up directly in line with that slot receiver. So again, that cap is a big red flag for a blitz for those reasons. Now, Wilson is a really smart quarterback, and normally he recognizes that kind of alignment and exploits it. Keep in mind, it's only 3rd and 2 here, so if he reads that slot defender is coming off the edge on a pressure, all he has to do is adjust his slot receiver, Tyler Lockett, to be the hot receiver pre-snap, and just run a short hitch or a slant to move the chains guaranteed, and also potentially get some nice yards after the catch to get into field goal range. The Bears were pretty much handing him a first down on a silver platter if he just ID'd that alignment before the snap, and that's a read I've seen him make so many times before, but he just flat out missed it here. Without that immediate outlet receiver being there to be his hot read, he had nowhere to go with the ball, and he was sacked because he only had 2 protectors against 3 rushers on the front side. And again, you can blame the line all you want, but they did not get Russell sacked on this play. Russell got Russell sacked. And I'll be 100% honest with you, he was not his usual self against this Bears defense at many key moments, especially in the second half, and it led to him being pressured probably more than he should have been. For the first time in a long time, I saw some doubt from Wilson in that game. He doubted his eyes when reading the coverage downfield, which led to hesitation, which led to a strip sack because he didn't get the ball out in the short window that he needed to on 3rd and 17. And not only that, on another play when stepping up into the soft spot that afforded him plenty of time to reset his feet and hit the big body Jerron Brown on a post route over the middle, he hesitated, took off running, and got strip sacked again from behind by Danny Trevathan. Wilson threw some classic Wilson dimes in that game, yes, but being perfectly frank about the tape that I watched, he had more to do with the sacks getting home than the line did. In fact, out of all 6 of the sacks I charted against Chicago, like I said before, Wilson was responsible for 3 of them directly. The fourth sack was that coverage sack I mentioned, which is obviously not the Lions' fault. Another one was because of Khalil Mack and Jonathan Bullard instinctively sniffing out a bootleg and disrupting the play before it could even develop, which again is not the Lions' fault. And the last one was that badly executed chip from the inside that I talked about previously in this episode, which put Ifedi into an even more impossible situation than he was already in against one of the best pass rushers in the league. And to me, I'm not going to fully hold Ifedi responsible for that one, because it's just not realistic from a coaching perspective to have him stop Khalil Mack one-on-one on a bull rush with a gigantic runway of a running start. That's just not physically possible for anyone, let alone a below-average right tackle. So if anything, that sack was more caused by poor coaching and poor play design to put him in that position and not give help to Seattle's most obviously lopsided matchup on the field. When you look at this tape from the Seahawks' first two games, to me what is most striking is how many little things there are left to fix, and yet they've still been pretty competitive in both weeks. It's all about improving chemistry to pick up stunts along the line, chemistry between quarterback and receivers before and after the snap, or even chemistry between quarterback and the coaches when it comes to play calling and play design. But what's encouraging is that even though there are still lots of little things to work on, they are just that, little things. You can give more help to Ifedi with chips to deal with speed rushers and immediately solve his biggest weakness in protection. You can let Russell run more up-tempo, spread passing concepts and get the ball out quickly and get him into a rhythm where he's more comfortable. You can alter how you use your running backs in protections or on chips and releases to better deal with stunts. There's so many ways to improve here that don't take that much time to implement, and ultimately I do think at some point Seattle will make those improvements. Truth be told, on film this line was actually holding up really well against the Bears on Monday night, and they certainly were vastly improved over their performance against Denver even though they gave up the same number of sacks. We all remember the big plays and the forced fumbles in primetime, but it's not like Seattle was getting roasted on every single snap like they used to be a few years ago. Believe it or not, this line is better and it's more consistent already, and there is quite literally nowhere to go but up from here. So while yes, Seattle is 0-2 to start the season and Wilson has taken some really bad hits through the first 2 weeks, don't be surprised if this offense and as a result this team looks entirely different less than a month from now. I'm not going to go out on a limb and predict a playoff run or anything, but it's still the Seahawks and it's still Russell Wilson. If you give that kind of quarterback even a half-decent offensive line, which I do think he will have pretty soon here, that's something to pay attention to in the grand scheme of things. The national media landscape can write whatever hit pieces they want and talk about the downfall of the big bad wolf of the West, but I've seen this story play out a few times already before. The Seahawks have always been a more dangerous ball club after they get punched in the face, and believe me, they've taken some big-ass haymakers so far. That Seattle counterpunch is coming against some unsuspecting team that marches into CenturyLink Field this season. Trust me on that. I don't know when, and I don't know against who, but it's coming. And when that punch finally does land, you better believe it's gonna really f***ing hurt. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. It was definitely not the direction that I expected to go in when I started it, but I'm glad I ended up where I did because the NFL, at least to me, is always a more interesting league when Russell Wilson is given a chance to make some magic happen. So if you are a believer like me that Seattle can surprise some people and maybe turn around their season this week in their first home game of the year against the Cowboys, believe it or not, it's their week 3 and it's their home opener, you're in luck because this week's sponsor, MyBookie, is still offering a huge sign-up bonus of up to 100% on deposits of up to $1,000 with promo code Brett. So if you did want to put a little bit of money down on that Seahawks-Cowboys game in Seattle for either team, really, now's a good time to do it because last time I checked, at least at the time of this writing, it is literally even money. Neither team is favored at all, so it's just a straight pick 'em. And there's some other great matchups that I'll be betting on this Sunday as well. Bengals-Panthers is a good one, Niners-Chiefs, Steelers-Bucks, Saints-Falcons. There's a ton of great games this Sunday. So again, if you want to maybe win a little bit of extra money while you watch those games anyway, head on over to the link in the description below, enter promo code Brett while you deposit whatever amount you want to deposit, and start betting. I'll be back next week with another episode, and then the week after that, I'll be in Mexico for a wedding, so I'm already working on that week's episode as well, because obviously I won't be able to work on it that week. So I'll be back soon with both of those, and until then, later.